What if I told you the most powerful nation in the world doesn't really control itself? That the president is powerless over the very institution printing your money? That 3 companies silently rule 95% of corporate America while you can't even afford a home? This isn't fiction. It's how America was hijacked, from railroads and farmland to Federal Reserve manipulation and trillion-dollar debt puppetry. This is the empire within the empire, and you were never meant to notice. Let's start from the beginning. So, in the 19th century, owning land was one of the most effective means to dominate and own the country. Under the Pacific Railway Act of 1862, Congress granted the Union Pacific and Central Pacific Railroads 174 million acres of public land, which were miles-long sections. And then something very interesting happened. Union Pacific insiders formed the Credit Mobilier Construction Company and covertly distributed reduced or even free shares of the company to key legislators and officials in exchange for favorable legislation and funding. When all of this broke out in 1872, it revealed how land grants might influence governments and give corporations complete control over new territory. Fast forward to now, and a small minority of big landlords continue to have disproportionate sway over local economy and politics. Private owners hold 1.3 billion acres, or roughly 60% of U.S. land. Some of those families may be unfamiliar to you, such as the Emersons, who own more than 2.4 million acres, or John Malone, who owns more than 2.22 million acres. Even computer CEOs like Bill Gates have purchased over 200,000 acres of agriculture in 18 states. In Nebraska alone, his Mount Edna Farms LLC now owns more than 20,000 acres. In November 1910, a secret group of American bankers, commanded by J.P. Morgan, National City, the First National Bank of New York, and a few other major banks under Senator Aldrich's auspices all visited this place on Jackal Island. Their purpose was to establish the Federal Reserve Act in order to manage America's money supply. The Rothschild family created the framework for central banking in the 1800s. However, despite many conspiracy theories, the family allegedly never had direct ownership of the Federal Reserve. Instead, the Federal Reserve is owned by smaller commercial banks in the United States. When Congress passed the act in December 1913, it established the 12 regional reserve banks, each of which was given the authority to engage in what is known as fractional reserve banking. This permits banks to hold only a portion of your deposit and lend the remainder to someone else. Now, this will blow your mind, but here's how it used to work until lately. Let's say you make a $100 deposit with your bank. That bank can lend up to $90 of your money to someone else. The remaining $10 is saved for you in case you need it. That's known as vault cash. Your bank account will still show that you have $100. However, on the bank side, that $100 deposit just created another $90 for the bank to give out. Let's imagine someone borrows $90 of your money and then pays someone for something they purchased. Then that person goes to their bank and deposits $90. And the bank does the same thing, lending out 90% of it. This method can be repeated until there is up to $1,000 in bank credit, all supported by only $100 in vault cash. Believe it or not, that is how it used to work. But let's draw a bigger picture here. Listen carefully. So, after World War II, the United States of America was the sole creditor economy, the only one that had a trade surplus, meaning it sold more goods than it imported. By 1945, the U.S. industry could produce 8 times as much as it could in 1941, soon before Pearl Harbor. Do you remember the Bretton Woods system? Essentially, we had $1. There were capital controls. As a result, we were unable to convert as much of our currencies to dollars as we would have liked. But the exchange rate was fixed. It was basically a currency union. We were in the dollar zone from 1944 to 1971, when Richard Nixon demolished the Bretton Woods system that the Americans had established. He destroyed it because the Bretton Woods system was designed as a managed worldwide dollar system based on the American trade surplus. In the late 1960s, there was no surplus. Where are the nukes? So, we have a hegemonic power from 1971 that is presently in the red. What happened to the British Empire when it entered the red? It collapsed. What happened to the Roman Empire? It collapsed. Every time a large power goes into the red, it begins to fade, and the fall is imminent. In the instance of the United States, between 1971 and 2020, assuming the epidemic began, its hegemony and strength grew rapidly, as did its trade imbalance. It is the only power in the world that has grown stronger as a result of falling more into a deficit. That has never occurred before. How did they manage to do it? And here's your answer. Retain a rigid monopoly on foreign payments. It was the only country in history to have a currency that was in high demand. People wanted the dollar even if they didn't want to buy anything from Americans, because when you put petrol in your car, if you still have one, even if it's a Dutch company, that buys oil drilled in, let's say, Nigeria from a Nigerian company with no American involvement at all, because it's denominated in dollars. Every time you fill up your petrol tank, you demand cash. You need to convert pounds, yen, or euros into dollars. As a result, ownership of the international financial system permits the United States to sustain hegemony far more than the vast U.S. Army, Navy, and Air Force. Kissinger knew this. Prior to becoming Foreign Secretary, he served as Nixon's national security advisor, and he asked the members, "How will we maintain our hegemony if we are in the red?" And the response he received was, "We'll make other people, capitalists from around the world, pay for our deficits." This is what's been happening. But why can they do that? Because they have an international stranglehold on payment systems. It is called SWIFT system. But as of March 2020, the system had changed. The Fed has now reduced the reserve requirement to 0%, implying that banks no longer have to maintain reserves. They can lend out the maximum amount of whatever you deposit, subject to the Fed's guidelines. Today, the Federal Reserve has a balance sheet of more than $6 trillion. They also have control over mortgage rates, which are determined by the 10-year Treasury bond, business credit, and the purchase power of our paychecks. And to this day, the president has no control or jurisdiction over the Fed and cannot fire the person in charge of it. And that is why some argue that allowing a few banks to control who and how many dollars are created is one method to own a country. So, if banks control money, who controls and owns the US stock market? There are many interesting hypotheses out there, but the Holy Trinity, BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street, is arguably the most popular. BlackRock has been the topic of a lot of discussion online. There is a robot that manages more wealth than any country on the planet. Actually, Larry Fink is the commander-in-chief. They own equity in 95% of Fortune 500 businesses and have been hired by governments around the world to help handle financial crises and even carry out routine operations. What amount of impact would you have if you controlled 88% of CEOs at S&P 500 companies? You've probably heard that BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street, or the Big Three, own the stock market. And actually, we need to talk about this. BlackRock boasts some astounding statistics. In 2010, they were dubbed the most influential financial institution in the world, and by 2014, they had $4 trillion under management, making them the world's largest asset manager. For comparison, the Industrial and Commercial Bank of China had only $3 trillion at the time. And, as previously stated, their assets have risen to more than $9 trillion over the last 7 years. It appears that BlackRock has a hand in almost everything these days. They are prominent shareholders in several of the world's largest publicly traded firms, including Deutsche Bank, into 4.881%. In 2020, the Chinese government approved BlackRock's establishment of a mutual fund in China, making it the first international asset management to do so. They also own stock in firms across Europe, in industries including as energy, oil and gas, transportation, food, and of course, finance. This money being invested in China isn't only BlackRock's money. The majority of this money comes from pension funds and bank accounts that ordinary people pay into BlackRock, unknowingly, because BlackRock controls banks. People have no choice but to give BlackRock and the CCP this money, if they know anything about BlackRock. This current pattern of BlackRock backing authoritarian regimes can only have negative consequences for Western democracy because it empowers governments such as China and Russia. It lends credibility to dystopian regimes, and this trend is encouraging others to do the same. I mean, BlackRock recently advised their investors to treble their investments in China. This adds billions more to a dismal dictatorship at the expense of the West. That is why BlackRock has been dubbed the world's greatest shadow bank due to its massive size and power, as well as the fact that it operates primarily behind closed doors. The Big Three have a vested interest in practically every firm in the S&P 500, with roughly $23 trillion under management and proxy votes on roughly 90% of U.S. equities. The three of them together own 95% of the stock in American corporations. How is that? That is not good. That is power. That means that when your average mutual fund or ETF, such as Vanguard's VTSAX, wants to vote on something, it looks to one of those three behemoths to cast its proxy. So what is a proxy? A proxy is simply your legal authorization to vote your shares at a company meeting when you are unable to attend, as is the case for the majority of employed persons. Now, if banks and companies may borrow unlimited sums of money, and the government can do the same by selling treasury bonds, who does the United States owe its money to? So here's the U.S. total debt so far. It is more than $37 trillion. That is a lot of money. Who is it owing to? And before we get into that, As of 2024, the United States had over 36 trillion in gross government debt, which is nearly 120% of something called GDP, which means the US now owe more than a full year's worth of all products and services produced in the United States. Now, of that $36 trillion, approximately 80% was held by public investors, with the other 20% represented as intergovernmental debt. Of the $29 trillion held by the public, foreign investors in other nations controlled around $8.5 trillion, or 30%, with $1.8 trillion shared between Japan and China. That's why you've probably heard that China and Japan own the United States, and might bring it down by dumping all of their treasury bonds at once. But that would almost never happen because, here's the catch, selling that many treasury bonds would cause bond prices to plummet, increasing interest rates dramatically, while also destroying the value of their holdings. In other words, the largest foreign holders of US debt have just as much incentive to keep borrowing prices low as we have. The more US treasuries a country possesses, the more its economy is dependent on the fate of the US economy. So it's ironic and counterintuitive. And no, other countries do not genuinely govern the United States. In truth, the Federal Reserve is the single largest holder of public debt, with more than $6 trillion on its balance sheet. The debt is now owned by investors such as state and local pension funds, banks, and insurance firms. If you own treasuries or bonds, as they are sometimes referred to, you are a part of it. You own a portion of America's future tax revenue, and you profit when the government pays interest. So, as a bondholder, you own a portion of America. The difficulty is that, at some point, investors are unable to lend money to the United States because our debt is deemed hazardous. Can the United States continue along this route indefinitely? Most economists say no. The U.S. federal debt is unsustainable. It is not at an unsustainable level, and no one knows how much longer we can continue. We're running very huge deficits at full employment, which is a scenario that we must address. We'll have to do it sooner or later, and sooner is preferable. And if you're going to lend your money to someone who is regarded particularly dangerous or on an unsustainable path, you should expect a higher interest rate. That means that as more money is printed and treasury bonds are issued, the U.S. must incentivize investors with ever higher interest rates, which will cost the U.S. more and more money in interest. It's an infinite feedback loop. One of the reasons President Trump wants to cut interest rates is so that the United States may refinance at a more reasonable cost. Now, if firms and banks can create endless sums of money and the United States is in so much debt, couldn't we just alter the system and elect the correct people to power and make everything better? It turns out that's rather difficult to do, and nowhere is this more apparent than in politics. In 2024, for example, 100 rich families spent a record $2.6 billion on federal races, roughly 1/6 of total spending. The top 50 individual donors shelled roughly $2.5 billion, with Republican contributions surpassing Democrats by about 2 to 1. If you recall, Elon Musk was a major contributor, donating hundreds of millions of dollars, the most of which went to President Trump's initiatives. But there's also Miriam Adelson, who gave more than $100 million in 2024 and is one of the GOP's largest donors. There's also Timothy Mellon, who contributed $197 million to elections virtually entirely to Republican-led super PACs. Add $1.9 billion in anticipated dark money expenditures by nonprofits and shell groups that hide their contributors, and you'll get the picture. But it's the same story on the Democratic side. George Soros' super PACs spent a lot of money. His Open Society foundations invested at least $140 million in organizations in 2021, on top of the more than $170 million he personally provided during the 2022 midterm elections. And in the 2024 campaign, Soros family-funded nonprofits like as the Texas Organizing Project received $600,000, while state Democratic parties in Wisconsin and Ohio received $250,000 apiece from Soros-related entities. This rabbit hole goes so deep, but for the purposes of this video, the idea is that the system spends a lot of money to influence who runs for office, how things are done, and who the winners and losers end up being. But all of this gets me back to the fundamental question: who governs and owns the country? And I believe the answer is, it depends on your values. And if history is any guide, it appears that BlackRock is destined to control an increasing amount of our daily lives. Perhaps BlackRock is simply a monument to a society divided between two large, too big to fail corporations and powerless, moneyless, and joyless citizens, in which corporations like BlackRock purchase all of our homes, inflating our currencies and benefiting from our conflicts and instability. That is why you cannot buy a home. This is why we are more divided than ever. That is why too-big-to-fail corporations are defining life in the 2020s, as we no longer live in a free market economy. We live in a system of socialism for the wealthy.